The courtroom was heavy with silence, the kind that seemed to echo louder than any gavel strike. 1,000 whispers had built up before, a current of scoffs, sideways glances, and half-suppressed laughter when Jasmine Crockett took her stand. But when she finished speaking, every breath seemed to freeze. Cameras caught at the shifting of bodies, the lowered eyes, the stunned faces of those who had been so quick to dismiss her. And then, at the very center of it all, Chief Justice John Roberts leaned back in his chair. His expression was unreadable at first, carved from the same marble calm that had defined his decades on the bench. But then his eyebrow rose just slightly, just enough, and in that small, human gesture, something far larger rippled through the room. It was respect. Visible, undeniable respect. The narrator's voice cuts through. When even the Chief Justice can't hide his respect. History just shifted. This was no ordinary courtroom moment. This was a chamber built on centuries of hierarchy, where voices like Crockett's, young, unapologetic, unafraid, were meant to be drowned out by tradition, by power, by the smug certainty of those who had always ruled the room. But that day, the hierarchy cracked, and everyone could feel it. Roberts, the gatekeeper of solemn authority, wasn't smirking. He wasn't brushing her aside. He was listening. More than that, he was impressed. And if he was impressed, the message was clear. Crockett's words had carried weight beyond the noise, beyond the dismissals, beyond every attempt to write her off. For a moment, time seemed suspended. No one moved. No one dared interrupt the gravity of what had just unfolded. Viewers across America sat forward in their seats, sensing they had witnessed something rare, the spark of respect crossing the deepest of divides. And yet this was only the beginning, because respect is one thing, but what comes after respect? What comes when power itself shifts ever so slightly in its seat? That is where history is made. The silence lingered, trembling with anticipation. And then came the moment no one expected. But what Roberts did next stunned everyone watching. To understand why the silence in that courtroom mattered so much, you have to understand why Jasmine Crockett was there in the first place. It wasn't a routine hearing. This wasn't another forgettable day of legal back and forth, where technicalities bury truth beneath mountains of jargon. No, this was different. The case before the court had become the flashpoint for America's most fundamental question: who truly gets to be heard? On the surface, it was about voting rights, election protections, and the constant battle over access to the ballot box. But beneath the legalese, the arguments carried weight far greater than statutes or precedents. This was about power: who holds it, who keeps it, and who has denied it under the guise of rules. The courtroom itself became America's highest stage for truth. Every attorney, every senator watching, every journalist scribbling notes, they all knew this wasn't just about a decision in one case. It was about defining who belonged in the conversation of democracy itself. And into this arena stepped Jasmine Crockett, a freshman lawmaker, a woman who many critics had mocked as too raw, too new, too unpolished for the marble halls of power. She was supposed to be overlooked, dismissed. She was meant to blend into the background, while seasoned veterans traded citations and procedural maneuvers. That's how it had always worked: hierarchy enforced by pedigree, by years of tenure, by the quiet, smug assurance of those who believed they alone had earned the right to speak with authority. But Crockett did not enter that chamber to play by their rules. She entered with evidence, with clarity, and most dangerous of all, with conviction. And conviction is something no robe, no gavel, no smirk can easily dismiss. Her words cut through the stale air, not with theatrics, but with undeniable truth. And that is why the silence afterward mattered so much. Because silence in a courtroom can mean hesitation, confusion, or uncertainty, but in that moment, it meant respect. It meant the critics were wrong. It meant the hierarchy had cracked. And when the Chief Justice himself leaned back, eyebrow raised, visibly impressed, the old power dynamic shifted ever so slightly. Crockett was no longer the newcomer trying to prove herself. She was the one who had landed a blow so sharp, so undeniable, that the very arbiter of the nation's highest court could not ignore it. This wasn't just a legal argument anymore. This was a cultural shift, happening in real time. The audience watching on television, the millions who would see the clip shared across social media, the young people who saw themselves in Crockett's fire and composure, they all felt it. For once, the stage wasn't owned by those who had always controlled the microphone, and that's what made it historic. Because this wasn't just about precedent, it was about presence. It was about who gets heard in America and who gets silenced. Crockett had turned a courtroom into a battlefield of legitimacy, and in one response, she forced even the most powerful man in that room to acknowledge her strength. Because when one response leaves even the Chief Justice speechless, the balance of respect begins to tilt. Asterisk, to grasp the full weight of Jasmine Crockett's moment, you must first meet the opposition, the so-called guardians of order, the entrenched elites who, for decades, have acted as though the chambers of power belonged to them alone. They were not villains in name, but villains in posture, in tone, in every glance that dripped with condescension. Their arrogance was not shouted from podiums. It was whispered in smirks, in carefully timed interruptions, in the unspoken assurance that they were the rightful heirs of authority and everyone else was merely trespassing. These figures, the senators, the attorneys, the old guard voices echoing through marble halls, carried themselves with a self-importance built over decades. They had tenured titles and traditions on their side, and with those tools, they learned how to belittle anyone who dared to challenge them. When newcomers like Crockett rose to speak, they didn't argue her points directly. They sliced at her credibility instead. They interrupted with cutting dismissals. They questioned her experience, as if truth required gray hair or a 30-year record in Washington to be valid. Their tactics were older than the Republic itself. From the beginning, American institutions had been dominated by those who mistook loudness for leadership and tenure for wisdom. History is littered with such figures, men who banged the table louder than their opponents, convinced volume could replace evidence, who thought inherited legacies outweighed lived realities. It was the same arrogance that dismissed abolitionists as dreamers, suffragists as hysterics, civil rights leaders as agitators. Always the same story, those in power believing they could shout down truth simply because they had always gotten away with it. And now, in this courtroom, the cycle repeated. The opposition relied on all the old tricks. Every time Crockett presented a fact, they wrapped themselves in procedural technicalities. Every time she cited evidence, they tried to drown her in lofty rhetoric meant more for cameras than for justice. Their arrogance was not hidden, it was wielded like a weapon, sharp and deliberate. But arrogance has a flaw. It blinds. When you believe you are untouchable, you fail to prepare for the moment someone refuses to play by your script. That blindness showed in the way they underestimated Crockett from the beginning. To them, she was another young lawmaker, eager for a soundbite, someone who could be swatted aside with a few well-placed interruptions. They assumed her resolve would crack under pressure, that her voice would tremble. She would defer to their years of polished performance. Asterisk what? They could not see what arrogance would not let them see was the storm building in her composure. Crockett was not there to trade insults or chase applause. She came armed with data, with precision, with the quiet fury of every unheard voice she carried on her shoulders. And that made her dangerous in ways the opposition had not accounted for. Their dismissive tone only amplified her strength. Every smirk sharpened her resolve. Every interruption gave her more space to expose their weakness. And the more they belittled, the more obvious it became to those watching. The elites had no answer to her truth. This dynamic, the old guard, the rising voice was not new. It echoed through history like a drumbeat. From Senate chambers, where women were told they didn't belong, to courtrooms where civil rights leaders were told to wait their turn, arrogance has always sought to dismiss dignity. But history is clear on one thing. Arrogance always underestimates resilience. And so, in that courtroom, the antagonists weren't simply individuals. They were the embodiment of every institution that had tried to silence someone like Crockett before. They represented a culture of gatekeeping, of elitism, of voices convinced that America's future must sound exactly like its past. But as the silence fell after her words, silence born not of dismissal, but of shock, they faced something they had never prepared for. The hierarchy they thought immutable had cracked. Their legacy, their posture, their condescension suddenly looked smaller against the dignity of a woman they thought would crumble. But arrogance blinds and through that blindness, Crockett's moment would strike. To understand why Jasmine, Crockett's words carried such undeniable weight in that hushed courtroom. You have to know where those words were forged, because they were not born in marble halls or elite universities. They were shaped in Texas heat, in neighborhoods where opportunity was rationed, in spaces where silence meant acceptance and speaking up meant risk. Jasmine Crockett did not arrive in politics by accident. She arrived because life gave her no other choice. From her earliest days, she saw the imbalance between what America promised and what America delivered. Growing up in Texas, she watched how some communities were showered with resources while others fought for scraps. She saw neighbors work themselves to the bone, only to be told they hadn't earned enough dignity. She saw families silenced by laws written far from their reality, by voices who thought policy-making was a game played among elites. That's where her fire was lit. She knew the law was not a neutral force, it was a battlefield. And so she studied, sacrificed, and worked her way into that arena, not because it welcomed her, but because it needed her. Every late night poring over case law, every unpaid hour representing those who couldn't afford counsel, every courtroom battle where she stood across from lawyers with deeper pockets and louder names, those moments built her steel. Her journey was not smooth. For every door that opened, two were slammed in her face. She was underestimated because of her age, because of her gender, because of her race. Because she didn't come wrapped in the prestige of legacy names. But that underestimation became her armor. When others dismissed her, she sharpened her arguments. When others tried to drown her out, she learned to cut through with precision. When opponents thought her passion was a weakness, she turned it into conviction that could not be denied. Contrast her path with that of the establishment figures she faced. While they inherited platforms, she built hers brick by brick. They leaned on privilege, she leaned on perseverance. Their resumes were padded with generational advantage. Hers was carved out of sacrifice and grit. That difference mattered, because when the two finally collided in the courtroom, one side spoke with entitlement, and the other with lived truths, and the latter has always had more power, if only given a chance to be heard. Jasmine Crockett's life was not just about her own rise, it was about carrying others with her. As a public defender, she represented people whom the system had already written off. As a community advocate, she stood with those who had been told their voices were irrelevant. And when she finally entered politics, she did so not with the polish of a manufactured careerist, but with the raw urgency of someone who had lived the stakes herself. She knew what it meant to be overlooked. She knew what it meant to fight uphill battles. She knew what it meant to be doubted, and she knew how to turn doubt into fuel. That's why in the courtroom, her presence radiated more than just legal skill. It carried the weight of every struggle, every sacrifice, every time she had chosen to stand tall instead of back down. People watching could feel it heaven if they couldn't put it into words. There was something in the cadence of her delivery, in the steadiness of her posture that spoke of a woman who had walked through fire and emerged unshaken. Her story was the very opposite of those who tried to silence her. They had always been told their voices mattered. She had always been told hers didn't stand, yet she made it matter anyway. That difference, that contrast, is what made her powerful. Because when someone who has been underestimated again and again refuses to yield, their words strike with a force no privileged voice can match. And Crockett's resilience wasn't just personal, it was generational. She carried echoes of ancestors who had been denied seats at the table, denied even the right to speak. She carried the spirit of every woman who had been told politics was not her place. Every working-class family who had been told justice was not theirs to claim. When she rose in that courtroom, it was not just Jasmine speaking, it was an unbroken chorus of all those silenced voices demanding to finally be heard. That is why her truth mattered. It wasn't polished for optics or rehearsed for applause. It was forged in struggle, honed through years of defending the voiceless, sharpened against every arrogant dismissal she had endured. It was the kind of truth you cannot manufacture, the kind that only emerges from the collision of sacrifice and determination. And so when she spoke, the room shifted. The elites didn't just hear her words. They felt the inevitability behind them. It wasn't just argument, it was destiny. And even those trained to mask their reactions, even the Chief Justice himself, could not fully conceal the respect that swelled in that moment. And that's why when her words finally landed, Roberts couldn't help but show respect. The quiet reverence of Crockett's opening was not allowed to linger for long. Almost on cue, the opposition surged forward with the arrogance of men who had long mistaken volume for authority. Their interruptions came sharp and fast, designed not to seek clarity, but to belittle. They cut across her words mid-sentence, layered their objections with a condescending smirk, filled the air with the cadence of dismissal. Yet Crockett did not flinch. Each time a voice tried to drown hers out, she steadied herself. Every attempted derailment was met not with raised volume, but with sharpened evidence. She reached for the facts like a warrior drawing arrows, loosing them one by one with precision. Where they offered sneers, she answered with citations. Where they tried to frame her as emotional, she countered with logic so airtight that even their interruptions began to sound hollow. The tension in the room thickened. The gallery shifted in their seats, the air buzzing with unease. These hearings were not new to them. They had seen posturing before. But this felt different. The balance of control was shifting, slowly, inexorably, in favor of the voice they had least expected, and through it all, eyes flicked again and again toward Chief Justice Roberts. He sat back, chin slightly raised, watching with an intensity that gave nothing away yet revealed everything. The courtroom wanted to signal some indication of where authority leaned, and though Roberts said nothing, the absence of his interruption became its own form of validation. Still, the antagonists pressed harder. Their arrogance could not allow silence to win. One broke in with a mocking laugh, trying to rattle Crockett's composure. Another waved dismissively, as though swatting away a gnat rather than acknowledging a fellow professional. These were not arguments, they were tactics of power. The maneuvers of those who had always assumed they could intimidate the underdog into retreat. But Crockett had not built her life on retreat. She inhaled, measured, and in the pause between interruptions, she let the silence settle. For a fleeting moment, the room stilled long enough for her next words to land with surgical precision. She spoke not with rage, with clarity, her voice steady and deliberate. If truth makes you uncomfortable, perhaps it isn't my words. You should interrupt but your own conscience. The line cut through the chamber like a blade through glass. No raised voice. No theatrics, just dignity sharpened into undeniable force. It was the kind of statement that needed no embellishment, because its weight came from the silence that followed. Every eye in the room widened. A few audible gasps slipped from the gallery. The antagonists, so quick with their barbs moments, before found themselves suddenly frozen, mouths half open, but emptied of rebuttals. The chatter died down. Even the shuffling of papers ceased, and then all attention shifted again toward Roberts. His body language spoke louder than any ruling could have. A subtle lean back in his chair, a faint tightening at the corners of his mouth, the arch of a single eyebrow together, it created the unmistakable impression of respect. Not approval of sides, not an abandonment of impartiality, but something more rare. Acknowledgement. The room understood instantly. Roberts' reaction carried the authority of centuries of judicial tradition, a kind of validation that transcended partisanship. It was a gesture that said more than any gavel strike could. That dignity, when wielded against arrogance, commands its own authority. And in that charged silence, as every heart seemed to beat a little faster, the audience knew they were witnessing something unforgettable. Roberts' reaction said what no gavel ever could. The tension that had been mounting for nearly an hour reached its breaking point. The courtroom, once dominated by the predictable rhythm of arguments and interruptions, now hung on the voice of Jasmine Crockett. Her opponents, so quick to sneer and belittle, had overplayed their hand. Their arrogance had created the perfect stage for what came next, the counterattack that would not come in the form of volume, but in the power of truth, sharpened by restraint. Crockett stood her ground, her hands resting calmly on the desk in front of her. She did not fidget, did not rush, did not rise to the bait of their smirks or interruptions. Instead, she paused. A long, deliberate silence stretched across the chamber. It was a silence that demanded attention, one that made every shuffle of paper and every cough in the gallery feel intrusive. Slowly, the courtroom itself began to quiet in reverence to that pause. When she finally spoke, her words came measured and deliberate, each one carrying the weight of lived experience. "You've dismissed my testimony as if it were just rhetoric," she began, her voice steady, unhurried. "But what I presented was not conjecture. It was fact. It was record. It was the truth you cannot erase simply by speaking louder than me." Her eyes swept the room not in defiance but in insistence. She looked at each face as if daring them to deny the evidence she carried. And for the first time, the opposition flinched. Their interruptions did not come. Their hands, once gesturing dismissively, now gripped the edges of the table with visible unease. Crockett leaned into the silence once more before delivering her next strike. "For too long, voices like mine have been talked over, ignored, and dismissed, because they lacked substance, but because they came from people this system wasn't built to hear. I know that, and yet I stand here anyway, because the truth doesn't need permission from privilege to exist." The line landed like thunder. A ripple of reaction coursed through the audience, some stunned into silence, others nodding in visible agreement. Even the stenographer's keystrokes seemed to slow, as though the words themselves required extra care to capture. The opposition tried to rally. One leaned forward, clearing his throat, preparing to interject with another condescending barb. But Crockett's composure, the authority in her presence, made the attempt falter before it began. He sank back into his chair, realizing that another interruption would only expose his weakness further. The tables had turned. The underdog had seized the upper hand. And then came the moment, the detail that would etch this exchange into history. Chief Justice John Roberts, who had sat with the practiced neutrality of his office, shifted. It was almost imperceptible, the faintest nod, his chin dipping ever so slightly as Crockett's words cut through the chamber. His eyes narrowed not in skepticism, but in the focus of someone who was impressed despite himself. His lips pressed together, a faint quirk at the corner betraying acknowledgement. It was subtle, but in a room like this, subtlety was louder than any applause. The gallery noticed. The opposition noticed. And Crockett, without even turning toward him, felt it. Robert's nod wasn't a declaration. It wasn't a verdict. But it was something far rarer, respect. Yes. For a Chief Justice that carried more power than any shouted rebuttal. Crockett continued, her voice gathering momentum now in volume but in resonance. This courtroom isn't just a chamber of law. It's a reflection of America itself. And if America cannot hear the truths of those who built its promise through struggle, then this institution fails not just me, but every citizen who depends on it. The gallery erupted not in sound, but in silence. The kind of silence that meant the words had pierced deeper than noise ever could. People leaned forward in their seats. Reporters' pens scribbled furiously. Somewhere in the back row, a spectator's eyes welled with tears, the emotion too powerful to contain. Meanwhile, the so-called villains, the entrenched elites who had dismissed her as unworthy of serious consideration, found themselves cornered. Their tactics had failed. Their sneers had dissolved into tightened jaws and averted eyes. Crockett had not just countered their arguments. She had dismantled their entire posture of superiority. And Robert's nod had sealed it. Signal had been sent, whether he intended it or not, in a space where hierarchy often dictated worth. The Chief Justice himself had, in that moment, validated the underdog. Crockett paused again, letting the room breathe before her final blow. She lowered her gaze briefly, then lifted it with unshakable clarity. You can interrupt me, you can dismiss me, but you cannot erase me. I belong here. My people belong here, and the truth will always belong here. The final words landed with such force that even the air seemed heavier. It was not the roar of triumph, but the steady, undeniable hum of authority earned. Had delivered her mic drop not with bravado, but with a kind of dignity that made resistance look small and petty. Roberts leaned back once more, the faint nod repeating itself, as if to confirm what the room already knew. Respect had shifted. The balance of power, if only for this moment, had tilted. And with that, the chamber seemed transformed. Had struck. No official ruling had been handed down. Yet everyone present understood they had witnessed a verdict of another kind, the verdict of truth. Validated in real time by the most unlikely arbiter of all. The underdog had not just spoken, she had been heard. And that subtle nod wasn't just acknowledgement, it was validation heard around America. The courtroom moment may have ended in silence. Silence has a way of echoing louder than any cheer. When the right eyes are watching, within minutes, the clip of Jasmine Crockett's words and Robert's unmistakable nod was already racing through the bloodstream of social media. By the time the hearing had adjourned, hashtags were already climbing the trending charts. Hashtag Roberts respect. Hashtag Crockett truth. Hashtag silence speaks. Each one carrying the weight of millions who felt they had just witnessed history slip through the cracks. Of protocol, memes flooded the digital landscape. On one side of the screen, grainy screenshots of Crockett's critics mid-interruption, mouths wide, fingers jabbing, faces contorted with arrogance. On the other side, Roberts leaning back, the slight but undeniable nod. The captions wrote themselves, "Volume isn't victory. Respect isn't demanded, it's earned." The gavel didn't silence Hertha, truth did. The internet had chosen its framing, and once the internet frames a moment, legacy follows. Commentators pounced on it, calling the exchange the moment dignity conquered arrogance. Progressive outlets ran headlines with words like reverberation and cultural shift, painting Crockett not as a lone congresswoman facing opposition, but as a voice of defiance whose authenticity had reached the highest levels of authority. Even centrist analysts, those who usually couched their commentary in neutrality, couldn't resist noting how Robert's nod seemed to puncture the myth of courtroom hierarchy, exposing a truth: respect cannot be staged. And while Crockett's stature soared, her critics stumbled into the glare of ridicule. The same figures who had spoken over her with smug certainty were now the butt of viral threads. Clips of their interruptions were remixed with laugh tracks. Their failed attempts at dominance captioned with "Try again" in bold red letters. Comment sections were merciless. "She didn't even raise her voice, and she still owned you," wrote one user. "Imagine being so wrong that even Roberts sides with the person you tried to shut down," wrote another. The digital jury had spoken, and the verdict was unanimous. For Crockett supporters, the viral moment became something bigger than politics. It became a story of resilience, a parable of what happens when truth collides with arrogance and wins. Communities that had long felt dismissed saw themselves in her composure, her refusal to shrink. The hashtags weren't just words, they were declarations of belonging. For young activists scrolling through their feeds, the clip became rallying fuel. High school debate teams played it before competitions. College students clipped Robert's nod into TikToks overlaid with captions like, "When the establishment finally listens." Even those outside political circles found themselves inspired, reposting with comments like, "This is what grace under fire looks like." The ripple effects were cultural as much as political. Late-night hosts ran montages, contrasting the critics' bluster with Crockett's calm rebuttal, their punchlines ending with Robert's nod as the final comedic mic drop. Editorial cartoons rendered the moment in stark black and white. Crockett, standing tall, her words ballooned across the panel, while her opponents shrank, boxed in by their own noise. Yet what gave the moment staying power was not just the comedy, nor even the viral reach. It was the validation, the sense that, for once, dignity had not only survived, but thrived against arrogance, and had been publicly recognized in the very institution where hierarchy usually crushes humility. In political circles, the aftershocks were unmistakable. Suddenly, Crockett was not merely another member of Congress. She was a figurehead for authenticity in the face of elitism. Invitations for speaking engagements poured in. Colleagues whispered about her rising profile, about how this moment had propelled her onto a stage far larger than the hearing room. Even some skeptics privately conceded that her poise had shifted the balance in a way they hadn't expected. But as the viral clip continued to climb, racking up millions of views, something deeper began to emerge. It wasn't just admiration. It wasn't just memes. It was recognition that the clip had crystallized a cultural turning point. Because, in the end, this was never just about one courtroom, one nod, or even one clash between arrogance and dignity. It was about something larger, something that pulsed beneath every repost, every hashtag, every headline. It was about who gets heard in America and who refuses to be silenced anymore. And the viral clip wasn't just admiration, it was a cultural turning point. In the quiet that followed the viral storm, something remarkable happened. The moment wasn't just remembered as a political clash, it was retold as a parable. Jasmine Crockett, standing in that courtroom, hadn't raised her voice, hadn't postured or begged for recognition. She had simply spoken truth with unshakable calm. And in that calm, the very foundations of power had been exposed for what they truly are. Because power, she reminded us, without ever saying the words, isn't robes, titles, or tenure. It isn't the prestige that clings to a bench, or the arrogance that hides behind centuries of tradition. True power is when humility, sharpened by struggle, stands tall enough to be undeniable. And in that moment, respect, not dominance, not hierarchy, was the only currency that mattered. The lessons stretched beyond that courtroom, beyond politics, beyond even Robert's nod. It was a universal truth that audiences felt deep in their bones. Composure beats arrogance every single time. Shouting may drown out a room, but truth commands it. And when truth is delivered with dignity, it doesn't just win arguments, reshapes authority itself. For those who had watched leaders stumble and flail through bluster, the contrast was illuminating. Crockett didn't humiliate her opponents with volume. She didn't seek to embarrass them with rage. She revealed their weaknesses by refusing to play their game. In doing so, she exposed something every underdog knows instinctively. Arrogance may be loud, but it is also fragile. And so, a new story took shape. It was no longer about a young congresswoman taking on the establishment. It was about the principle that in America, respect is not a gift bestowed by the powerful, it's something earned. Even from the most entrenched elite, when truth refuses to be silenced, Crockett's nod from Roberts was more than acknowledgement. It was the system itself momentarily bowing to authenticity. That's why the moment carried weight far heavier than any soundbite. Because people didn't just see Crockett, they saw themselves. Immigrants who had been talked over in boardrooms. Women who had been dismissed in meetings. Young activists told they were too inexperienced to matter. In Crockett's calm rebuttal, in Robert's silent validation, they saw proof that dignity could bend even the most rigid power structures. It's why the moment echoed with such force. It's not because it was rare to see conflict in the courtroom. Conflict is common. But because it was rare to see dignity win. It was rare to see respect break through the walls of hierarchy. And it was rare to see a Chief Justice, bound by centuries of judicial decorum, let even a flicker of admiration shine through. That flicker meant everything. The crescendo of the story isn't Crockett's words alone. It's the silence that followed. It's the nod that punctuated them. It's the reminder that respect, when freely given, carries more authority than any gavel. In that silence, a truth emerged that resonated far beyond Washington. Power is not about who talks the loudest, but about who speaks with unshakable conviction and earns respect without demanding it. And so, as the clip continues to be replayed, reposted, and remembered, It takes on the quality of history itself. Not the kind of history written in dusty law books or official transcripts, but the kind of history that lives in memory and culture. The kind of history where the underdog redefines the stage, where humility stands taller than arrogance, and where silence says more than speeches ever could. Because in the end, history wasn't written by the loudest, wasn't shaped by the arrogance of those who thought hierarchy could drown out truth. It was written, once again, by the one who spoke with calm, by the one who held steady under fire, and by the one whose words drew a nod from the highest seat in the land. And history, once again, wasn't written by the loudest but by the one who listened, nodded, and validated. From the very beginning, this story wasn't supposed to belong to Jasmine Crockett. The establishment dismissed her, critics scoffed, and the opposition tried to reduce her to background noise. Yet, what began as another routine clash transformed into something unforgettable. A young Congresswoman standing tall in the highest courtroom, delivering words so sharp and so dignified that even Chief Justice John Roberts could not remain. Unmoved, we watched the arc unfold: dismissal, clash, rebuttal, and then the turning point, Roberts leaning back, eyebrow raised, offering the kind of validation no headline could capture. That subtle nod reverberated louder than any gavel. It was respect, and it wasn't just for Crockett. It was for every person who has ever been underestimated, interrupted, or told their voice didn't belong.
Yes.
And that's why the moment went viral, because it wasn't about politics alone. It was about dignity, conquering arrogance. It was about truth commanding authority in silence. And it was about showing the world that power doesn't have to be shouted, it can be earned. Simply, when truth stands unshaken, John Roberts didn't need to speak. His reaction alone shifted the courtroom, and with it, a narrative much bigger than one hearing. If you believe moments like this matter, moments where composure triumphs over arrogance, where respect bends the room, then be part of this movement. Subscribe, share this story, and keep this wave of dignity alive. Because every time we amplify these moments, we remind the world of what true leadership looks like. Because respect isn't demanded by shouting, it's earned by truth that even the highest court cannot ignore.